Hello everyone. I hope you're all keeping safe and your families too. So, unfortunately, the school had to close and we did not finish talking about triggers and stored procedures, which happened to be the last uh, topic on our syllabus for the semester. So, I decided to make this short video to kind of do a recap of what we have discussed in class. So, I won't go into much details on all the issues we covered in class. We'll focus more on the examples which we started but we did not complete. So we'll do the examples at the end and I'll show you how to create triggers, how to test them, how to create stored procedures and so on in MySQL Workbench. So I decided to make it a video rather than a live session because I don't want a situation where the internet will be dropping some people in and out of the call. So here we go. For this lecture, which we started talking about procedural language in SQL in the class, we covered some parts of what an introduction of what the procedural language is, some examples of different types of procedural language that we have for the different database management systems, then what triggers are, what stored procedures are. So just a quick recap, like I said, procedural SQL, the conventional SQL that we have been learning so far from database 1 and the beginning of database 2 just allows you to create statements that will read, write, and do some manipulation of data in your database. But what it does not allow you to do is conditional execution of those SQL statements. For example, you may want to carry out an SQL statement based on certain condition or do an alternative SQL statement if that condition is not satisfied. We don't have in the regular SQL or structured query language, it does not support that conditional execution. Or another drawback of it is that it does not allow you to do kind of like a loop. It's called a do while loop. So it doesn't loop operation. So sometimes you want to carry out some actions and you want to do those actions repeatedly until a certain condition stops being true, then you exit your loop. These are all things that you're familiar with in other programming languages like Java, C Sharp, and so on. You can do all of these actions, but you can do them in SQL. So that's why it's important to have this procedural SQL. What basically the procedural SQL does is to allow you to combine a set of SQL statements to work together and also give these extensions, we call them, which are what allows you to do the if conditions, the while loops, and so on. So you arrange this set of SQL statements and how you want them to be executed in something called a persistent stored module, or PSM. Okay, and this PSM is executed on the server side of your database. So in class, I explained in detail how the architecture of applications work. Those that work with database, how it's connected, and how the application executes. So if you want to do any data manipulation and you have created those data manipulation actions as a procedural SQL or in a persistent stored module, this will be executed on your database management system server, not on the application side. And we use the PSMs to kind of represent what we call business logics. So the business logic is just a fancy way of saying this is how I want these actions to occur in this organization. So let's have a practical example. Let's say somebody is going to buy some items in a store, and you go into the shop, you pick some items, put it in your shopping cart, and go to the checkout counter. When the cashier is scanning your items, they're doing a couple of things. They're pulling out the prices from the database, from the product table. They're also when when you purchase and your payment goes through, they're also reducing the stock of items from your inventory side of the database. So you arrange the order of how you want actions to be executed based on how they operate in the real business. And yeah, so that's what the PSM allows you to do. And you can now share this sort of business logic that you've created using your PSM to different users, and you don't have to worry about, well, if this application is going to also do similar action, I have to write the codes and embed my SQL within my host language to run the statement. Or yeah, so you don't actually have to create those statements every time that your application needs. You have it stored in your database server side, and you just share it to different users. Then you can also protect these activities, because not everybody within the organization should be able to have access to execute all your persistent stored modules. Somebody should be, some people are more interested in others, or some people's jobs require them to process some stored procedures, but they do not have any business having access to other stored procedures. So you can kind of give authorizations to different users to your different stored procedures or PSMs, depending on which one they require to use. So moving on, the examples of different procedural languages components that we have, for Oracle, they have something called PLSQL, okay? And there's the anonymous PLSQL block, which we discussed in detail in class, and only Oracle supports the anonymous PLSQL block. Then we have triggers, stored procedures, and PLSQL functions, which are supported in the other RDBMSs like MySQL and also MS SQL Server. So this is an example of the anonymous PLSQL block, which kind of counts how many products you have that are between certain price ranges and displays it on the console for the user. So we won't go through this because we have done it in class in detail. So MySQL triggers. Now, from now on, we are going to focus not on the Oracle procedural language, but on MySQL. For the Oracle procedural language, we have the Oracle programming with PLSQL course that I said I can give you access for those who are interested, but currently we are not giving access to all students, only those that are actually interested in doing that particular course, and it will not count towards your grades for this course. So anyway, just let me know via email or Google Classroom if you're interested in that. So since we've been using MySQL throughout the semester, we're going to use MySQL to see how we can create triggers and also how we can create stored procedures. So what are triggers? Triggers basically are actions that you want to run automatically anytime you do either an insert, an update, or a delete command on a table. So mostly you want an action to happen either on that table or on a different table based on you carrying out a different action. And triggers are very important in allowing us to enforce a couple of business rules and to do various things, actually business rules, doing backups, and also just making it easier for you to process your data. Some of the data manipulation can actually be done automatically, so you can use triggers to do all those automated ones rather than having to put in your values manually all the time. So some advantages of using triggers is that it makes your application development faster because you're removing any data processing coding from the application side and you're moving it to your database side. And once you do it one time, you don't need to worry about any kind of application that will connect to that database that requires such business rules to be enforced or do those actions that are done in the triggers. You can still use those triggers for it. It's also easier to maintain because you have it in one place on your database server. Any update that you do there automatically reflects in any application that connects to that database and uses that trigger. So in the classroom, we had a different example of a trigger. If I remember correctly, I think we did a trigger that will, hold on. Anyway, I'll come back to that. So I have a new trigger that I created. The codes for creating the trigger is in here. So I'll just explain briefly what that trigger will do, and then we'll switch over to my SQL workbench and then test that trigger. probably see if I can pull out the other trigger that we did in class. So um, this trigger will allow you to automatically add the expected return date from your borrowing table. So remember, in our database, we have a table called borrowing table, and we said anytime a library user comes in and picks out a book to be borrowed, then their information and the information of that book needs to be stored in the borrowing table. At least the ID and the ISBN of the book needs to be stored in that borrowing table. Yes, which reminds me. So the original trigger that we had was to automatically add, that wasn't it. Anyways, we'll come back to that. So yeah, so when you store that information in the borrowing table, there are a couple of columns that we have in our borrowing table that should be calculated automatically. For example, we have the expected date of return in our borrowing table. So since we already know based on the business rules, so now you see how we're going to use the triggers to enforce a business rule. From our discussion with the librarian, she told us that one of the business rules that they have is that students can only borrow books for up to 3 weeks. So if you borrow a book and the date of that you are making that borrowing is recorded, automatically you should know the date for the return. So how do we make sure that our database stores that date for the return? You can create a trigger that will use the date you're inserting a value into the borrowing table to automatically calculate when the return date will be and store it in the required table. So let me just switch through to the MySQL workbench and go to the. So in order for you to create a trigger on Workbench, I think we've done this, but it's a good idea to actually go over it again. So you choose your table, whichever table you need to create the trigger on. So I'll just collapse this one so it'll be easier to see. So I have my bunch of tables here and I need to create my trigger on the borrowing table. So you click on the spanner button next to your borrowing table to allow you to edit the structure of your table, and this page will appear. Usually the default tab will be this columns where you can see the data types, the column name, and so on and so forth. So while we're here, it's a good idea. I've already done this elsewhere, but I will need you to do this because it's going to matter in the next start procedure that we're going to do. See this date overdue that we have? I need you to edit it, so double click on it and change the overdue and remove the name and remove the question mark. So there was a question mark before, just take it out. It should be just overdue. Okay, then apply the changes. Also, before you do that, check that your date borrowed. So if this date is just called date, also change it to date borrowed. I think we initially had something like this, just a date. Date is a keyword in SQL, so it gets kind of confusing when you're writing your statements and then you're using keywords as column names. It won't give you an error, but it's a good idea to just avoid it. So it makes it easier for you to remember the names when you're writing your SQL statements. So just add borrowed here to have your date borrowed. Then make sure that this PK tick box is checked, because you need to have three attributes forming your primary key for the borrowing table. We have the date borrowed column, we have the user ID column, and then we have the book ISBN columns. These three columns make the primary key. So make sure that all three columns are checked as PK. Make sure that the date is now called date borrowed. Make sure that overdue doesn't have the question mark at the end of it. Once you do that, then click on the apply button. I'm not going to click on my apply button yet because I've already done these changes. So this is just to show you how to do it. Click on the apply button, click on OK, and then it's done. So once it's done, then at the bottom here, you can see the triggers tab. Click on that triggers tab. Then on this left hand side, you have different kinds of triggers that you can create. You have the before insert, after insert, before update. So basically what these triggers say is, if you create a before insert trigger, the action will be carried out anytime you attempt to insert into that table. So remember, the base table that we're creating the trigger on is what? Borrowing. Triggers are created on tables. So if I want to do an insert statement on my borrowing table, before I do the insert statement, it will do whatever action I've created within the trigger for the before insert. If I want to allow the insert to happen first before I carry out that action, then I create an after insert. If I want to do some action after I update some values in that table, you do a after update, and if it's before, and so on and so forth, also for delete. So in this instance, we're creating a before insert trigger. So what we want to create actually is to determine the return date. That's just what this trigger is doing. It's going to determine the return date for your borrowing. So create when you select this, so I've already created mine, you can see it there, so I won't do it again, but make sure you highlight the before insert, then there's a small plus button here, click on that plus button and it will automatically name your trigger and so on. Then it will give you this space to write, however it will look like this, okay, without the codes. So you have your create definer up here equal to create user, sorry, so you have the create command. The create command is a data definition command. You use it to create tables, create indexes, create all any kind of thing that you need to create within your database. You use the create schema and so on. So create, but you're saying who is the definer of this trigger that you're creating. It's the current user. So you say definer equal to current user. That's whoever is logged in that session of your database. So then create trigger, the trigger keyword needs to be there, then you name it. Okay, so you name the trigger. In this, it automatically names it by appending the name of the database to the name of the trigger. So it's called the library dot borrowing underscore before insert. You can actually change this name to reflect any name that you want, but I'm just leaving this the way it is. Then okay, then you have the type of trigger, whether it's a before or after and so on. So this is a before insert trigger, so you can see it here. On which table? On the borrowing table. Then it has this keyword for each row. It's important to make sure you include this for each row because it tells it that anytime a new row is being inserted, anytime a new row is trying to be inserted in that table, it should carry out this action within the begin and end block. Okay, just checking this is still recording. All right, so we're still good to go. Okay, so within the block you type out your statement. So I just copied and pasted whatever I typed in here before. So I have this line that is just a comment. So if you want to create a comment within your SQL statement, it's a good idea to always add comments because it helps you to explain what's happening within the codes. So you use a star, you use a forward is for backward forward, use a forward slash and an asterisk, then whatever you write within the asterisk and the forward slash is a comment and it won't be processed. You can see it's highlighted as blue. Then you start by I'm declaring something called a variable because I want to have some sort of temporary variable. So you can see in the comment I said I want to create a temporary variable to hold the return date. First of all, I need to determine the return date. It's a calculation that I need to do to say, okay, I will use the current date that I have as well as the return date and then store it in there. So I will declare a variable called temp date and I give its data type. So to declare a variable, what you need to do is use the declare keyword. So you say declare, then you give the name of the variable. In my case, it's temp date. Then the data type of that variable, it's a timestamp. Then you put a semicolon. Okay. Then I'm now going to set that or calculate what the return date would be. So remember, I'm going to set it based on today's date with the addition of, should be 3 here, addition of 3 weeks. because the return date should always be 3 weeks from the date that you're doing the borrowing. And while you're doing your insert, you're putting today's date in the date borrowed column. So you don't actually need to try to select it. You can just use the current timestamp. So you now do the setting. You set the temporary date, the variable that I've created. I'm assigning a variable value to it. So you assign this value. What value am I assigning? I'm selecting the timestamp. This is a function, okay? This function timestamp add is uh, if you have a timestamp data type, you can actually add days to it, weeks to it, months to it, years to it, hours, minutes, or seconds to an existing timestamp. What's the existing timestamp I'm working with? It's this current timestamp. That is the current time at the moment that I'm working, right? And what am I going to add? I'm only interested in increasing the number of weeks. So I will now use the function timestamp add. What am I adding? I'm adding week. How many weeks am I adding? I'm adding 3 weeks to which variable? To current timestamp. Okay, so and it will calculate this and assign it to the temp date. Then the next thing I need to do in this trigger is to assign the value from this temp date into the column for my expected return date. So you now say set new dot. So you either use variables new dot or old dot. If I'm using the column names from the table on which I am creating the trigger, then I will just say new dot. Okay, that is before I add any value to it. Then that's what I'm trying to get. If I'm doing an after, then it should be old dot. Okay, so you can decide to increase. Sorry, hold on. Okay, so you can actually reference other columns from other tables within your trigger. Okay, you can actually work on other tables within your trigger. The action may be that in this case, we want the action to happen on the same table that we're creating the trigger on. It's possible to make the action happen on a different table, which reminds me of the other trigger we created, but we'll talk about that after this one. So we're setting this column name called expected. We have date borrowed. Remember, I changed mine already. We have expected return date. We have the actual return date. We have the column that says overdue, whether it's overdue or not. We have the user ID, the book ISBN, the return condition, and the fine amount. So let's go back to the trigger. So we're setting that expected return date to be equal to this temporary date that we calculated by adding 3 weeks to today's date. Remember, the business rule says that students can borrow books for 3 weeks. Okay, so we can make this a little bit more complicated and say it needs to first of all check if the student is if the user is a student, then it will add 3 weeks, whereas if the user is a staff, then it should add I think it's 4 weeks or so. It's a higher number of weeks, but hypothetically, let's just assume all the users are currently students, and then we can modify our trigger later to capture that the other condition for if the user is a staff. So we have set new dot expected return date equal to temp date, and you're done. So you apply this. So I'll go ahead and apply mine. And okay, so I'm just going to remove this part of the SQL statement because it's trying to redo the changes that I've done before. So I only wanted the trigger to be created. So I'll click on apply, and it is applied successfully. Now my trigger is created. Okay, so I have a problem with my SQL with the interface, the workbench. Anytime I create a trigger, it disappears. Ideally, it should appear, it should still be visible here, so I can edit it. Let's go to that table that you've created the trigger on, then expand the triggers, and you can see the trigger is there, but I can't even edit it from here. So that's a very big negative for us. So if you make a mistake, you actually have to, if you have the same problem with mine, then if you need to edit your trigger, the only way to do it is to go and drop that trigger and recreate it again. So hopefully you don't have the issue. The command drop trigger this. So for example, I created a previous trigger which was an after insert, borrowing after insert, and I dropped it. So this is the codes I used to drop it. So drop trigger, the name of the trigger, semicolon, execute it, and it drops your trigger for you. Then you can go back and create it again and do your editing. So when you put your commands for whatever you want the trigger to do, make sure you copy and paste it somewhere in a text pad or somewhere as a backup. So now that we've created our trigger, the next thing is to test that trigger to make sure that the trigger actually does what it is supposed to do. What is our trigger supposed to do? Anytime we record a new borrowing in the borrowing table, it should calculate the date it expects it to return automatically. So I'm going to go back to my trigger before, and I did the trigger before, and I also, okay, let's revert this. So it did the calculation for me. So anyway, let's just add a new value. So remember, date borrowed has a default value. You don't need to create your date borrowed. You don't need to add any value. It will take the current timestamp. Expected return date is going to calculate it using the trigger. Actual return date, you can't put anything here anyways. You have to wait until your user returns the book for you to do that. Overdue, you won't know obviously until you return it. So what we need to do is to add the user ID. So I think I have a user called 100 who has even borrowed books before, and I have another book called 300 that I have not yet borrowed to this user. User ID and book ISBN. So just put values that you know exist in your user table and in your book table. Don't put values that are brand new in here. So click on apply and apply. Okay, so you can see it says successfully done. Close this and we'll select from the table again to see what happened. Make sure you select again because that's the only way you can refresh it. So where can we find it? So the 100 and 300. So this is the new column that I added, and you can see that it automatically assigned my date borrowed to be 30th of March, which is today's date, at 2:32 p.m. and which is the time I created this trigger. Then it has calculated my expected return date to be 2020 April 20th of April 2020, which if you actually check that, it's exactly 3 weeks from today. Okay, so you can see that our trigger actually works. So good. Now the other trigger we tried to create in class, I don't have it here because I probably deleted it or something. So the trigger we added in class was that we're supposed to reduce the amount, the quantity from the book table. So anytime you do a borrowing, obviously you're reducing. Let's look at the book table. So here's our book table, right? Here's our book, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. That's the one with the borrowed. So ideally you should have a trigger that will now automatically reduce your available copy anytime you make a new borrowing. So how do we did the trigger halfway. We got the trigger to work, but we didn't add a where condition into our update where it's supposed to -1 from this, so it will trigger because we want it to be done when after the insert statement has worked. So I'll just type it out directly here. This will probably be in you have it. We did it in class, but if you don't, you can just copy from what I am typing in here. So so what you need to do is to, what are we doing again? We're going to reduce the quantity. Okay, good. So after insert, you need to now update your book table set, let's check the name. The name of the column is called available copies. Let's see the spelling. Available copies, no space, no underscore. Let's go back to our trigger. Set available copies to be equal to, what do we have? The current value minus when we're just reducing it by 1. Since obviously people only borrow 1 copy of a book at a time, equal to available copies minus 1. So I think this is where we stopped in the last trigger, and it worked, but it was reducing for all. What the problem was that we didn't add a where condition. So if you do an update without a where condition, it applies that update to all the rows within that table. So we want to only do it for the current insert. So remember, this is a borrowing that we're doing. We said for each row, so it matters. Anytime a row is added, it will execute this. Therefore, you will already have the value stored somewhere. So that value, the value of the book, so let's say the book ISBN, we already know the book ISBN because we've added it. It's when we try to insert this book ISBN here, this 300 that we're working with, okay, in our example. So we will now say where old dot, since we're doing an after insert, it means that we have already done the work. So I will check this. If it doesn't work, we'll change it to new dot. Old dot, so old dot and new dot is telling the system to reference this column name. You're going to find it in the borrowing table. Okay, in the borrowing table, that's the table you're creating the trigger on. So you don't need to say, for example, borrowing dot or from the borrowing table or anything. So this is the keyword to use, old dot or new dot. It references the current table you're creating the trigger on. So where old dot book underscore ISBN, just double check that to make sure the spelling is correct. Yes, book underscore ISBN is equal to, then remember we're doing the update on the book table, is equal to ISBN. ISBN is the name of the column. Sorry, I think it's supposed to be where ISBN is equal to all dot. Yes, this should be the right syntax for it. So you need to end your statement with a semicolon. So update the book table. We're setting the column called available copies from our book table to be equal to available copies minus 1. That is decreasing the value with 1 place, where the ISBN for that row is equal to the ISBN of whatever you're adding in your borrowing table at that moment for that row. Okay, for each row, remember that keyword. So once you do that, then you can now apply, and yeah, so you can see it says drop trigger if exists. So if you have another trigger with the same name, it drops it. If you don't intend to drop your old trigger, make sure you change this name to something else, and then you remove this drop trigger if exists. So I think I had a before trigger previously, so it's not going to drop it. Okay, so I have an error message. There is no old in row. Okay, so that's the problem. I wasn't too sure whether we use old or new. Let's try new. Old means that there was an existing value in there, but in this case it's a new record we're inserting, so we can't have an old. But if you're doing something like before of update or after update or before delete or after delete, that means there was a value in there that you were trying to delete or trying to update. So you can now decide to pull the old value before it was updated or the new value after it was updated. But for insert statement, it will only work for new because there was nothing there before, so there's no old, you only have a new value, and we're doing an after insert, so we can use new. I hope this will work and it won't say it has to be a before statement. yeah, okay, so that works fine. Close, see my problem, it disappears, but anyway we can still see it here. So to test it, you go back to the borrowing table again. You now add somebody else to borrow another book. So let's add that the person 200 is borrowing the book 300. Okay, so apply this and apply, and it works. So I need to select my 100 borrowing book 300. You can see that it automatically added the date borrowed from our default value. It automatically calculated expected return date from our trigger, our before insert trigger. But then how do we check if the after insert trigger works? The after insert trigger was supposed to work, the action was supposed to be done on the book table, not on the borrowing table, remember. Okay, so you go to your book table, you select, remember, take note of the available copies that we have here, and we're borrowing book 300. So let's select this, and you can see from 8 it has reduced to 7. That means both of our triggers have worked. Alright, so I think we can move on from triggers to stored procedures. So let's quickly go back to the lecture notes. Alright, so this codes for the trigger is actually the one that we just created. Second one, the first one we created. We just need to change this to 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks, and yes, so that's it.